ci siamo, perfetto.
Okay, let's start, let's go on.
Let's go.
Donatella.
Let's go. Let me introduce you, Leonardo.
Please.
So, it is a real pleasure to have Leonardo participating in this series of the lunch seminars. The idea came last year, and we had waited a bit because we hoped that it would be possible to have Leonardo offline, to have him with us, but unfortunately it is not possible. What happened in the meanwhile is that we had talked with Leonardo about another book, and now in the meanwhile he wrote a new one. So we still will have the possibility to invite him in person to present the other book when this will be possible given the pandemic situation. Anyhow, I just wanted to introduce Leonardo. He's a professor of political science at Lewis. He has been professor of political science at the University of Florence and at the Istituto di Scienze Umane, that was also located at Palazzo Strozzi, and from which our history started. He has been president of the International Political Science Association between 2009 and 2011. He is an internationally acknowledged scholar, in particular of democratization process of Southern Europe, of comparative politics. He has been visiting scholars in main institutions like Princeton, Oxford, IEP in Paris, One March Institute in Spain. And he has done a lot for political science in general, and in Italy in particular. He has been president of the Italian Political Science Association. He has directed the main journal of political science in Italy. And this commitment notwithstanding, he has been able to study a lot and to write a lot. He's the author of 40 volumes. Many have been translated in many different languages. He has co-edited a huge work, the International Encyclopedia of Political Science, and he has been working recently on the issues of democracy and a relationship with the social inequality. He has written on the impact of the economic crisis in Southern Europe with Palgrave. He has written a book on political science with Sage, a book on changes for democracy, actors, structures and processes for Oxford University Press. He has been also with Oxford University Press on democracy and consolidation. For me, Leonardo is not only a friend, but someone who has changed my life, because when I was in Berlin and I thought I was there forever, Leonardo proved that the Italian academia is not as parochial as it looks like. And I had the chance to be a colleague of Leonardo as a young associate professor and then as full professor in Florence. And he has been for me not only an example of successful attempt to combine commitment to academia, commitment to research, and commitment to the professions, but also an example of how to develop institutions that are inclusive and have high merit. In the book that he presents, he says, pointed the importance of reflecting on the issues of inequalities, in particular social inequalities and the ethnic inequalities. He addresses the issues of the relationship between social and politics in times of crisis. And I appreciated in the introduction of the book that he also points at the importance of keeping in our professions, and attention to the production, not only of short articles, but also of full books that can illuminate big problems, like the connections between inequalities and democracies. So Leonardo is going to talk to us about this book. I welcome him once again, and I give him the floor for this presentation. Thank you, Leonardo.
Thank you, Donatella. Thank you for the nice, friendly presentation. I appreciate a lot. Let me explain immediately the title. You see, Inequalities and Democracy, a few afterthought. First of all, I will not present, although I will mention it, I will not present the entire research. This was a large research that took me busy for a few years, for almost 8-9 years, and I'm going to present just a piece of research. Not a small piece, but a piece of research. But once, and this is my second point, once I finished writing the book, I realized, if Francesco can go to the second slide, I realized that actually I was ready to write a book. I don't know if you remember the introduction by Popper to the Open Society as Enemies. And Popper was just referring to this kind of feeling. It is when you finish writing a book, you feel you are ready, you think that you have much clearer idea on how you could have written that book. And that is my feeling, and this is the reason why I said afterthought. So let me convey some general point about research, the specific point about inequality, and above all, some afterthought that, I don't know, maybe will bring me to another publication, anyway, another research effort precisely on this topic. Let me, if you can go on with next slide, let me also clarify that I had in mind a book about inequality for many years. But my feeling is that the mainstream of political science was not ready for a book about inequality. My professor in a part of my life, my mentor, my much cherished mentor, Bob Dahl, actually wrote his last book on political equality. That is the idea that even when we talk to a so powerful and so a powerful idea, a so powerful notion as equality, we are not able to pick up, in a sense, the right notion. The right notion is what everyone has in mind. And the people has in mind economic equality, social equality, ethnic equality, gender equality, youth equality, not political equality. I will come back on this point. And to me, this is a problem and a limit for part of political science, where virtually the problem of the equality was a problem hegemonized by economists, by some sociologists. As the book also deals with the problem of freedom, freedom was in the hand of legal experts, of jurists, of constitutional law scholars. So in a sense, the core of political science, at least in my view, now let me put it differently. The core of politics was out of political science. In a sense, this is the tragedy Ricci was speaking about years ago. Maybe actually this is the tragedy, because we all know, for example, that democracy is not a procedural dimension at all. When we consider democracy, and when we say also Dahl was speaking about procedural democracy. Also Bobbio, to tell the truth, Sartori, all of them. And I see why those scholars were pushing in that direction, were emphasizing that direction. In the 50s, in the 60s, it made a lot of sense. But today, we have to recognize that for a citizen, for a people, for everyone, what is relevant is freedom, and freedom is also freedom of, say, business initiative. Freedom is freedom economic initiative. And freedom by itself is not a procedural aspect, because it implies the right of property, imply all these aspects relate to market and capitalism that we all know. So let's be open. Let's accept these kinds of challenge. Let's. He said after the '89, in early '90s, in a sense, in terms of our research, we are in a new world. Let's accept that we are in a new world. Let's accept the challenge of analyzing freedom as a content of democracy, and also equality as a content of democracy. To be fair, years ago in the 80s, Doug Ray wrote a good analytic book about equalities. Sidney Verba with Oren, they were analyzing political equality, but also economic equality. Probably the best book about equality was written, at least in my view, by Larry Bartels on inequality in the USA, and why the strongest, the wealthiest people were much better represented in the USA. So there are exceptions, but as I said, the mainstream of political science was much more. Political science was politics was much more attention to party organization, to parties, and similar. I mean, you know, I don't think I have to say more about this. Next slide, please. With this in mind, with this background, I decided to show how freedom and equality had become differently after the Great Recession. At least after the period 2008 to 2014. But why then I choose to consider, to include in my analysis a much larger span of time? It's obvious. Only if you consider last 30 years, you see the change. Otherwise, you don't see the transformation of 2008 if you don't know what was the previous situation, if you don't know what is the subsequent situation. So I could not just focus on the years of the Great Recession. I had to consider also the previous years and the subsequent years. Second point, why the choice of the 6 largest countries? No doubt my choice can be debated, can be discussed, can be criticized. My basic idea was, let's consider the people, and let's consider the situation in terms of equality and freedom of most of European people. If you consider the population of UK, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Poland, you have almost 2/3 of Europeans. If you consider the Europeans are about 500 millions of people, these countries, the 6 countries, the 6 largest democracies, are on total approximately 300 million, 360 millions of people. So most of European people. And then if you say and you see UK out of Euro, Poland, you see also the different situation at in international level in terms of some key economic factor. So with this kind of worrying, with this kind of research need in mind, I made this choice. The research question, you can read it in terms of implementation of freedom and equality during this period, and in terms of contribution role of European Union. Now, what are the main results in a nutshell of the research? Please, Francesco, go ahead. Clearly, even if I only consider 3 kinds of inequalities, you see all the problems immediately. And you look at the data, you see the problem. So, worrying trend in terms of decreasing equalities, in terms of increasing inequality, if you like. In the book, I selected economic, social, and ethnic equality, but actually I devote a few pages also to 2 other very important inequality that are gender inequality and youth inequality. And probably in my next work, I will much more develop this other two inequality. When you consider the trend of personal, civil, and political freedoms of the 3 main freedom that, again, I choose also. Of course, this was kind of, I mean, every one of you know that there was a kind of choice, a kind of choices that was necessary also to make the research, a very large research, feasible. And also in these years, it took me a lot of time, a lot of problem with the qualitative analysis, a lot of difficulty. Anyway, once I said, let's see what are the level of this kind of inequality and the level of the freedoms, I asked, okay, but what the people want? During the year that I have analyzed, people was looking for equality. Of course, this is not something that you can take for granted, because there is a lot of people that, on the contrary, was looking, say, for solidarity or for justice, for different values, or even they don't care about equality. For example, when we did with Hans-Peter Crisi and Monica Ferrin, actually Monica Ferrin did a lot of work, but we did the survey with European Social Survey. We saw, for example, that in Northern Europe, most of people was very much paid attention to freedom, to civil rights, rather than to the equality. Maybe the reason because they took for granted the problem of equality. The problem of equality was much more present in the mind of the people of Southern Europe, in the mind of in the people of Eastern Europe, for example, in Poland, and as we see this an important aspect. Consequently, we see position of a different party that also are different in the different countries. But we also see immediately another aspect that actually totally change, in a sense, the overview that we can have about this issue, particularly on equality. While if you consider the old research about some of these aspects, for example, one of the few good research on this is by Stephens, Hubert Stephens and Stephens on the welfare. And when you look at that research, when also you look at the previous research, even by Iversen and Soskais, or some other research, about this. There is no doubt, in a sense, leftist parties are committed much clearer to equality. As we will see, this not happen any longer in the years that I consider, but I will come back on this point. There is a large chapter on explanation of inequality, and actually here in my presentation I will devote my attention to this chapter. And then there is the analysis or explanation of freedom, and also in this case is interesting how less freedoms comes from more information, how less freedoms comes from more rules, how, in a sense, particularly in these years, with the technological development, there are limits to freedom, to the different kind of freedom, when you have more information, when you have more rules. But this is something I devote attention in the chapter. Then there is a part where I analyze the role of European Union, and of course, particularly on equality, the role of European Union is minimal and indirect. But once I've considered this, next step is to show the indirect but inexorable link between equality and freedom. And out of this, we come to the present patterns of democracy, contemporary patterns of democracy, in terms of protest, in terms of unaccountability. But again, this is what I will partially I'll skip. Let me concentrate now on the explanation of inequality and how the picture that I provide is different from the past, simply because of a change, a profound change vis-à-vis the past, a large change vis-à-vis the past. Next. So in this outline, let me very quickly on some definition, very quickly on explanation and on connection between freedoms and equality. And the key point at the end is related to participation and responsiveness. This is the outline of this second part of the talk. Please. The debate about the notion of equality is very large. And of course, my point was to come to empirically feasible analysis, to an empirically feasible analysis of equality. This is the reason why, keeping in mind the two main aspects of equality that are relevant, equalities of opportunity, equality of result, I focused on the economic equality, basically measured by the Gini index. I was also working on the Piketty proposals and so on, but basically in terms of result, when I wanted to check with the data, there is a large overlap. So maybe we can use the Piketty proposal, but there is no real difference vis-à-vis the classic traditional Gini index. Of course, social inequality means above all the aspects of the welfare, social protection, healthcare, and education. This is, in a sense, the column through which we can see the ways to be more precise, to try to overcome, to try to redress social inequalities. Ethnic inequality is a more, in a sense, different concept. It's a different concept. Here, in a sense, you see economic aspect, social aspect. Ethnic inequality has to do with culture, with the cultural aspect. So at the end, this becomes relevant because of the immigration, the phenomenon of the immigration. In this presentation, in the book, there is a lot about ethnic inequality. In this presentation, let me above all focus on social inequality and a little bit on economic inequality. Next slide. What I try to avoid, and what I think is a source of confusion, is if we talk about political equality. Again, colleagues also recently, good important colleagues, Douglas, Wolfgang Merkel, for example, but also I mentioned Verba, above all Robert Dahl, was stressing political equality. But when we come to political equality, and for example, we pick up the last book by Bob Dahl on political equality, and we try to get a definition of political equality, you see that political equality is something that make reference to what? Make reference, if we consider in a closer way, make reference to civil rights, make reference to rule of law, make reference to free and fair competition, plurality of media. There is, in a sense, something that is different. At the end, it's a complex notion. Again, if I situate historically the reason why there is the reference of political equality, I fully understand. I fully understand. If you have in mind what was the culture and the zeitgeist of the 50s, of the 60s, you fully understand. Because we have at the same time a strong appeal of the notion of equality, but the idea that some procedural aspect of democracy has to be on the spot. So I think this is a reason why at the end, but again, in the mind of the people, there's not political equality. We were checking this with Hans-Peter Crisi, with Monica Ferrin, and in the mind of people, there was, civil right, evaluation and assessment of civil rights, but and also an assessment of social rights, an assessment of equality in terms of economic equality, of social equality. So let's skip, let's in a sense forget political equality. Let me go ahead. When we come to the explanation then of Francesco, if you can go to the next slide, please. Then if we go to the equality and we go to the main explanation of equality, we can see at least two analytic chains. If we stress the actors, you see the first chain that end in some policies. If you stress the process, that in my view is more important, you see the change from dissatisfaction to a request from equality. And here, let me say, the empirical research stress the relevance of the idea of the poverty. How is politically important the problem of the risk of poverty in all these countries, in all this time, also for all the parties. Of course, then you have a policy decision as a result of responsiveness. But here in between the request and the policy decision, what there is? Matter of fact, what comes out very clearly is the voice, is the protest, much more than the parties. This is, at the end, in a nutshell, the conclusion of my research. Go ahead with with the slide, please, to support empirically this point. Again, if we start from what people want and from what parties commit to, we realize first there is a stronger attention to equality when there is dissatisfaction. Equality means, first of all, fight against poverty. And then, this is probably one of the key elements of my result, the search for equality, the fight against poverty is highly, as I wrote here, highly context and time dependent. Became much more important with the Great Recession. It's more important in Spain and in Italy, and also in Poland, vis-à-vis Germany, vis-à-vis France, vis-à-vis UK. So here there is clearly differences in terms of what people want and what the parties are committed to. But as I said, and I stress, when we say party are committed to, vis-à-vis the time where Huber, Stevens, and Stevens, vis-à-vis the time where Soskais and Iversen were doing the research, now the issue of equality is an issue that is shared and is promoted by rightist parties, by even extreme rightist parties, not only by the left. And even in the left is a much more watered. This is the truth. If you consider the third wave, if you consider the transformation of a social democratic party, and we will see when I will check this aspect more precisely, we see that the problem of equality is no longer on the spot, no longer in the first line, no longer at the core of attention of leftist leaders. Let's go on with some aspect. I don't like to take much time because I think it's more important for me the discussion. Of course, when I tried to be more precise empirically, I said I think that the data suggests to me that economic situation, technological changes, development and industrial organization, working conditions, there are all factors that are important to explain the demand of people and party supply. But again, keep in mind what I said earlier, because I think it's more important. Let's go on. Next slide, please. This is my first hypothesis. And the first hypothesis asks, is the type of democracy, is the constitutional arrangement an important determining factor in terms of implementing a better equality? Well, when I quote here Iversen and Soskais, that in a sense was addressing a different question, and they saw, again in the past, in the early years of this century, a strong correlation between the proportional electoral system, coalition, or leftist government and redistributive policies. My data do not support clearly this kind of conclusion. Maybe it's a slightly different question, but basically what I see is the fact that economic factors comes first. The fact that the type of capitalism comes first. The type of political translation of a capitalist arrangement comes first. Let's go to the next slide. That is a slide that could be problematic for some aspect, but is interesting from one important aspect. That is, we see, if we consider equality in terms, as I said, of social rights and of implementation of social rights, we see one of the best form among all the countries, the best form of implementation of social rights in France. That is when there is an hyper-majoritarian constitutional arrangement. But what is characteristic of France? As you see, a coordinated market economy. So this is at the end what, in my view, is the thrust of the analysis. Where it's interesting how, even with a lot of majoritarian component, in Poland is, in a sense, is a mixed situation. It's not a real majoritarian. Just to clarify in a nutshell, yes, there is the first past the post for the election of the Senate. But there is a proportional law, although high threshold, 5-8% threshold in the election of the House of Representatives, and there is the direct election of the head of state. So you could say it's a quasi mixed majoritarian country. But again, what is also in this case important is the attention to the equality. And Poland is a case where there is a strong attention to the equality. There are policies in favor of redressing inequality in a very, very clear and strong way. Next slide, please. My second hypothesis is this one. And this is the hypothesis where more clearly we see the result. That is where voice, adaptive institutional responsiveness is really what happened. Here, the chain is very clear in terms of dissatisfaction, even in terms of polarization, and as a result of protest party. But protest party that were pushing for policy for redressing inequality. Go ahead with next slides. Here, from this point of view, you can have a different kind of solution. At the beginning, a social movement, then a social movement that becomes a party. Social movements can be the case of France. Social movements becoming a party, you can see with Podemos. Immediate institutionalization, you can see with five-star movements. So you can have a different solution in terms of unconventional participation. But unconventional participation is a key point that show the result, bring about the result in terms of better policies, even partial policies in terms of redressing inequality. Next slide, please. Here you see the new parties and the result, the electoral result in the growth of new parties. And here I will come back to the Poland, to the peace, because it's a very relevant example of what we have here. That is a party that is developing a narrative against freedom, to have free hands to implement much better equality. And they actually do it, although in terms of limiting result as a whole when we consider the democracy, with the problems that we'll see in a moment. But anyway, in all these cases, you have some development of protest party, being on the left side of the spectrum or right side of the spectrum. Next slide, please. Next slide. We can skip this, maybe we come back, but I'm taking time, so Also, we can skip this data. You see that also in Germany, there is polarization. Not only in Italy. But here, I think this is what is more interesting about this hypothesis. It is, yes, you have in the country policies in favor of redressing inequality. But with these formulas, social and political voice in Spain, political voice, anti-establishment, even anti-party sentiments in Italy, a social voice, quindi reaction, a social voice in France, and in Poland, distributive policies with a strong rightist component, with a nationalist loyalty, with a narrative in terms of Christian Catholic values. The same kind, a similar, not the same, not at all the same, a similar narrative that we can find in Hungary. So again, this kind of hypothesis is much better empirically supported. This kind of second hypothesis is much better empirically supported vis-a-vis the first hypothesis on the constitutional arrangement and the type of democracy. Let's go to next slide. You can see within this hypothesis development of the kind of populism. The piece is a kind of identitarian populism, again, with a content in terms of attention to equality, but you have also on the left a kind of reivindicative populism that you can see in the five-star movements, you can see in Podemos very clearly. Next slides. The third hypothesis, in a sense, this is a classic hypothesis. Stronger leftist incumbent parties, better implementation of equality, you can say. This hypothesis is not really supported. This is the truth. This is, in a sense, what is against the previous literature that I also mentioned. That is, when we consider, next slide, please. When we consider, for example, the trend of the Gini index, also you can see next slide, please. When you consider the trend for the 6 countries of the Gini index, there is no connection, no clear, unequivocal connection between an improvement of the Gini index and the leftist party being in the government, being the incumbent. Of course, for several reasons. Too short time in the government, a too watered policies in terms of attention to equality, because also the rightist parties were promoting policies of inequality. Yes, there are all 3 reasons, but no longer is correct to say that if in the government there is the left, you have a better solution in terms of redressing inequality. Next slides. These are a few data about, but I think I made the point, so I don't come back. Go to the next slides. In my previous hypothesis, in my previous 3 hypotheses, I was pushing, I was emphasizing, I was choosing domestic explanation, domestic factors. Here, I consider an external explanation. I consider 2 external explanations. One looks at the role of the European Union. And of course, here it's important to consider the cohesion policy, because at the end, even sometimes indirectly, the cohesion policy could be relevant in terms of improving the situation of inequality. But as I say here, the amount of resources allocated, the amount of resources devoted to that policy is negligible. So it's in a sense, is irrelevant. And even if you consider the impact of austerity measures, and we consider the six-pack, we consider the fiscal compact, we consider the two-pact, the 6 countries under examination were affected to different degrees. Germany immune to the crisis. Poland had even not in 2009, the year when everyone in Europe, every GDP in Europe was declining, except in Poland. So it's not relevant. Poland experienced, as I wrote here, a sustained growth during these years. So again, the austerity measure in some country could be considered a minor obstacle, but an obstacle to redressing inequality in other countries. So the role of the European Union is a role at the end not in favor of equality. But I think what is more important to consider, and that casts a different light to me on our entire discussion, is this aspect. When we have been conceiving equality as an ideal of democracy and establishing equality as an ideal of democracy, actually is after World War II. That is during the third years, the glorious Trent. There is the third year of economic growth. When you have the change of economic equilibria, when you have the switching of the equilibria from West to China, then and you have as a consequence years of stagnations, years of no growth, years of very low growth, then actually the very ideas of democracy are casting doubt. And this is a sort of unavoidable truth we have to, an unavoidable empirical truth we have to confront to. So actually, when we consider external explanation, in a sense, a new perspective is opened that bring us to reconsider how and if in future is possible the implementation of social equality, of social protection, healthcare, education, as we had in the past. If you can go ahead. Anyway, if we consider these 4 hypotheses, and we consider different aspects of the 4 hypotheses, we have to see how the problem of equality, the problem of implementation of equality is related to the responsiveness. This is the key point to take into account. It's related to the responsiveness. And the problem of responsiveness is related to the voice, is related to participation. So again, when we move from a view focused on equality to a larger view to better understand how inequalities are redressed, how equalities are implemented, we have to go on considering participation and responsiveness. Next slide, please. But when we consider participation and responsiveness, we see also the indirect connection with freedoms. Let me clarify this point, because this point is I think, is very, very important. You know that in our tradition, in the history of political thought, a solid literature that says that between freedom and equality there is a trade-off. Empirically, this is not so. Please go to the next slide. When I was analyzing the implementation of freedom, implementation of equality in about 60 countries in the world, you see there is a very strong connection, no doubt. The problem, if you can go to the previous slide, please. No, previous slide. Again, to the previous slide. The problem is to understand better what is the kind of indirect connection between freedom and equality. And you can see, please go to next slide. Next slide. You can see this if you make a reference to a working rule of law, if you make a reference to electoral accountability, even if you make a reference to interinstitutional accountability, where the key point is also the role of the media, the critical role of the media in implementing that kind of accountability. If we consider the effective chance of participation, if we effective fair competition, but all these are related to freedom, imply the guarantee of freedom. And now we go to an old story that maybe a lot of you, a lot of us remember. The point that Bobbio made many decades ago was precisely the connection between freedom and equality, but saying freedom comes first as a condition of equality. And Sartori was repeating in a very eloquent way that same kind of proposition. The reality is not so. After 89, after 90, with the process of democratization, freedom and equality are mutually connected, but are mutually connected in this indirect way. A working rule of law, a working institutional accountability, effective chance of participation, a fair competition. Of course, if there is polarization, a much higher polarization with all the aspect of radicalization that imply, means a stronger difficulty to realize this kind of aspect. So when we see the implementation of equality, we have to, at the end, to go to this kind of systemic view, where freedom is not the engine, is no longer the engine. There is a mutual connection. I would like to stress this, because all my data, not only my previous research, but also this research, suggests this. Please, next slide. Next slide. However, we have to confront, previous slide, previous. Okay, however, we have to confront a political narrative that put in direct connection freedom and equality. And this is a Kaczynski narrative. This is an Orban narrative. This is a narrative of the leaders that say, we would like to implement egalitarian policy, but we need free hands. Free hands without being checked, to be unaccountable, to be irresponsible for the policy. So the point is, the consequence is a weakening of interinstitutional accountability. And this happened in Poland. This happened in Hungary. In Hungary meant even to be much closer to hybrid regime. Poland is, at least in my view, in my analysis, in my assessment of Poland, still a minimalist democracy, but it's a minimalist democracy. But the crux of the matter is the weakening of the institutional accountability. And as is clear in the data that I show in the book, when you have the weakening of institutional accountability, you have the weakening of freedom. So the institutional accountability is related to freedom. So this is again, the indirect way. If there is a direct way, if there is a trade-off between freedom and equality, this is suggested by an ideological position that is a narrative to justify is a political and a politically irresponsible position by Kaczynski, by Orban, by this kind. Let me say that weakening of interinstitutional accountability at the end bring about the end of democracy. That is the end of the minimal possibility of implementing also equality. I think we have not only the example of Hungary, but a very telling example what happened in Venezuela. Chavez, in this first year of the century, he was really implementing equality. The Gini index changed in terms of redressing inequality, no doubt. But then corruption came, then limitation of interinstitutional accountability came, and then came the disaster, the tragedy that the Venezuelans still live now. Let's go to the next step. The next slide, please. So what are, in a sense, my afterthought, if I can say so? If you consider what I said earlier in terms of external factors, in a post-Western world, that is, in a world that is no longer dominated by Western countries, equality is a value more difficult to implement for economic reasons. The growth, we have no longer this kind of perspective of growth. But of course, we may have we have to look for other ways to implement equality. My second point, equality is no longer a value of the left only. And this is one of the reasons why we had also a successful right. Where the reason of the National Front in France, for example, the National Front in France was one of the first rightist parties to understand this point. In the mind of the people, there is a much stronger attention to poverty rather than inequality. The survey data suggested very clearly this point. And even there is, as a result also of work in psychology, cognitive psychology, justice, people is very sensitive on justice rather than inequality. It's apparently this data suggested that injustice, unfairness is much less accepted than inequality if inequality is complemented, say, by merit, by effort, by commitment. We have been always doing with solidarity. What is curious, if you read the European Union document, is that you have much more present the the term and the notion of solidarity rather than equality. The unavoidable conclusion, if we would like to promote egalitarian policy, this is possible, but it depends on the fact that the people strongly wanted to the protest, or even only to the threat of the protest. And this is the only way to be successful. Next slide, please. How to do with the pandemic then? If this is the picture, what happens with the pandemic? I developed another piece of research where basically my conclusion about the impact of the pandemic is that the pandemic has a catalyzing effect. That is, the pandemic is only pushing processes that are already underway. If this is correct, of course, this is a kind of analysis that may consider a lasting of the pandemic for 1 year, 1 year and a half. If the pandemic is going to last for a longer time, I don't think that this kind of analysis will be any longer a correct one. But this said, with this caveat, one aspect that we can see, we can anticipate, is an entire rethinking of the welfare state. The welfare state was, in a sense, was already in crisis. And we can expect a revision of the policies for the welfare state in terms of more attention to health care, in terms of more attention to child care, in terms of adoption of direct cash transfer, in terms of more flexible welfare tools, in terms of a switching toward universalism rather than from targeting, in terms of course, a related aspect, developing digital infrastructure for having welfare provisions more effective, more timely. Please go ahead to next slide. In terms of reinventing the welfare, in terms of reconsidering the welfare not as a mean for redressing equality, but a mean as a shock, as a risk absorber. Of course, this is a possible transformation of the welfare. This is a possible transformation of social rights. This is a possible transformation of how equality will be conceived in next future. But in this case, we have not to lose the other aspect. It is meanwhile, this was not what was happening in the 40s, the 50s, in the 50s, in the 60s, when there were the parties where there were a different notion of representation. Because today, in addition to a possible rethinking of the welfare, there is a profound transformation of a representative mechanism because of the technological transformation, because of the possibility of manipulation of the public opinion through the social network. So the situation is much more complex. In front of this situation, the director of LSE, a very well-known economist, Minouche Shafik, 10 days ago, published a book on a new social contract. With attention and sensitiveness as economist, she was proposing to have a new contract where security for all investment in capability, efficient fair sharing of risk are the new principle to implement in terms related, as I said, to equality. But that means, in a sense, a new or a renovated or a revisited, but something different in terms vis-a-vis the previous notion of implementation of equality, the previous notion of social rights. If I have to conclude with my research, accept, of course, this kind of direction. My empirical research can support this kind of direction. But at the same time, if you go into details in terms, for example, of higher productivity, in terms of the change of relationship with business and so on, it's difficult to avoid some kind of skepticism, and at the end, a message that say, okay, let's go on as you like, but the problem of the poverty has to be at least a problem that should be on the top of the agenda. Thank you very much.
Leonardo, thank you very much, because you gave us a lot of ideas about which to reflect, and especially the impression that we need to have you for a couple of months at least, rather than just for a couple of hours to discuss all this. Many of the things that you have mentioned resonate very much with the research that we are doing in our faculty, in particular the moving of the center-left parties away from reflections of social inequalities, and on the other hand, the mobilizations of social movements for social justice. It makes also me thinking about the process. You are bringing back the social dimension and the economic dimension. So a bit like returning to Barrington Moore or Marshall in the explanations of the interactions. You are bringing back also normative thinking. So while political science developed on an empirical theory of democracy, it seems to me that now it's time, and what you are doing is also to bridging these normative and empirical issues. You are, I think, bringing also back in agency. So like in analysis of democratization, the reflection is on unstructured or semi-structured situations in which the agencies of the actors can play a major role. I think that the open questions is why did the hypothesis of a trickling down of freedoms into equality didn't work? So why Doll or Lipset's could not predict the end of the Trente Glorieuses, and the fact that electoral accountability is not sufficient to bring in and defend the interest of a majority. What I think is still open is that someone has the mic.
Okay.
It's you?
Okay. Sorry.
No problem. And I think that one of the issues is really to see if this is a trend or a cycle. So if it is a sort of Polanyi's type of development in which through counter movements to neoliberal market-oriented policies, we can go back to some more social protections or not. I think these are all relevant issues, and I don't want to take all the time of the debate. I want to see if there are people who want to ask questions.
Yeah, may I have a reaction immediately, because you raised a few questions. Let me just pick up one question only, because of course, you know me, Donatella. I was asking myself why a colleague such as Lipset, that was so careful about, I mean, because of his past, because of everything about this aspect, in a sense was overlooking this element. Why Dahl was very, very careful with the social aspect. I think that here we have to complement two elements. One element, and you have a litmus test for this. We have one element that is a development of political science as a discipline. That is the idea of getting identity, of getting his own identity. And that was something that particularly Robert Dahl was also devoted to. And the other aspect was a political aspect, because, of course, these guys had a hidden normative message, had a hidden normative component. And the hidden aspect was to try to bring into democracy the left. And the only way to bring into the left the democracy was to say democracy is procedural. But of course, this opened up all illusion. I've been, you know, because of my interest, I've been a lot in Chile, studying Chile and so on. The poor Salvador Allende was believing in procedural democracy. And you see the result. That was the big illusion. That is in the attempt of bringing the European part of the European left into democracy, we made a lot of disasters with excellent intention. So here again, you complement a normative position, the worrying about a left out of democracy, and a discipline position, developing discipline. This is, I think, the reply to one of your questions. Then let's have the other question. And thank you very much for your comments. Donatella, credo che you have the mic.
Yes, sorry, Mario Pianta, yes.
Thank you a lot for your presentation. I have two type of questions. One, when you discuss the historical evolution, I think is an important element is to take into account, on the one hand, the different economic conditions. So if we compare Spain and Italy, Spain and Poland to Germany and France after the Great Recession, clearly the good economic performance of the core of the European countries, as opposed to the poor economic performance of the European periphery, is a clear structural difference, which goes beyond the institutional dimension on the one hand and the historical variety of capitalism aspect. So, and more generally, the impoverishment of most of countries which used to be part of the most advanced group. Italy is a case in point. Italy has not had any improvement in GDP per capita in the last 20 years. So we are in a completely different context where both individual expectations and dissatisfactions compare in terms of economic inequality and in terms of social mobility and so on. They operate in a completely different context as opposed to the period of rapid growth of the post-war decades. And to some extent, this applies also when we make comparisons with a very large number of countries, because also the trade-off between democracy and freedom is much easier to solve if you are a large, rich country with a lot of possibilities for redistribution to the poor and so on, as opposed to the case of a smaller, poorer countries where economic opportunities are much smaller. So these are the position in the hierarchy of economic and political power of countries, and the impoverishment brought by the long depression of the last decades seems to be two elements that can be taken into account in this discussion. Thank you.
Yes, Donatella, I like to reply immediately.
Please go ahead.
Mario, if you accept, I call you by name. Mario, let me tell you that when some years ago I started working on this, your books were some of the first books that I read. So let me take this occasion in a sense to thank you. No, of course you are right. You are right. This is what I was taking into account when I said, if you remember in my slide, also in the book, context, highly context dependent. Of course, I did not develop this aspect because this is an aspect that you developed. What new I could do after the work by you, by other economists. So I went in a different direction, stressing the political aspect, of course, the political explanation. That was, was a research choice. Of course, I agree. Now, another point, Mario, there is no trade-off. Empirically speaking, freedom equality has no trade-off. There is a convergence, mutual convergence. The trade-off is something that is presented by authoritarian leaders for an authoritarian design.
No, I basically meant the space for the ability of combining both equality and freedom. Of course, okay. If you are more powerful and richer, there is more space for going in.
I agree.
Thank you.
Andrea Felicetti. Andrea, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. No, I'm fine. Thank you very much, Professor Morlino, for this very stimulating presentation. In your presentation, you made reference to a twofold point. Less freedom comes from more information and from more rules. So I would like to ask you to expand on that. And in asking that, I also present something that I'm puzzled by. When it comes to information, I think we live in a time, many think that we live in a time of communication overload. That means that poses great cognitive challenges to democracy. And therefore, the horizon of, for instance, cognitive justice, as opposed to cognitive equality, is pushes people like me to lean towards justice rather than equality. In terms of freedom and rules, so more rules put a limit to freedom. I see how that works, but I also think that in thinking about freedom today, it's very important to reflect about the enhanced greater need for coercion. So today there is a growing interdependence between countries, many times not democratic ones. And so coercion plays a much bigger role perhaps than in the past. And so how to deal with that is kind of challenging to reflect upon. Thank you very much once again.
Okay, Andrea, thank you. very, very huge question. So let me say, first of all, in my presentation, I was not analyzing this aspect, not at all. I was presenting very quickly at the very beginning. I analyzed this aspect much of course, in depth in chapter 3, chapter 6, and also chapter 7 of my book. By the way, my book was published since the beginning by Oxford University Press as open access. So you can download the entire book if you're interested, and you can go. I'm very precise on the two paradoxes and on the working with the specific data. Let me give this quick reply. First, and I confess, Donatella, that was a disaster, because most of my qualitative analysis was gathered between 2012 and 2013. In 2015, most of it was obsolete, and particularly on freedom, because after the terrorist attack in France, the legislation in Europe on the freedom dramatically changed. The problem of security, so I mean 2015, after 2015, the first is security. Forget all the other aspect. All the elements that I say, more rule, less freedom, and more information, less freedom, comes from specific aspect that every country developed in its legislation. So are very detailed. And if you like, you can go there, and there is the analysis of everything is relevant.
Thank you. I have Petra and then Guido. Petra,
Thank
please.
you, Donatella. Thank you, Professor Morlino, for an outstanding lecture. I have a question. I'm most fascinated by this shift among political parties. So my question, to front load it, is, what is the future of the European left? What can the European left do? Because it has to now compete. I mean, we are seeing that the Tangal, the economic axis left-right, is cross-cut by Tangal on identity, and we are having this radical right, which is having a redistributive agenda. You mentioned PIS. I find it really fascinating, and I think it's really, I mean, this is really testing the commitment of people to democracy as a system, when they're saying, look, we are giving you all this money, but the price is going to be your freedom. So I would like to ask you, maybe it's an unfair question, but I would really like to hear what you think is what can the European left do? How can it adapt, and what can it offer to win people back? Thank you.
Yeah. Petra, an important, dramatic question. Let me say this. When you address the question, you make an assumption. And the assumption you make, that is, in the future, there will be a left. Okay? So, let's take for what is a normative assumption. Let me add very openly, I like this normative assumption. I care for a future of a left. And the future of a left can only be, you remember my distinction between revendicative populism and identitarian populism. The future of left can only be inclusive, non-identitarian, can only go in that kind of direction. Inclusive, not identitarian, and not only taking care of poverty, but taking care of equality in a more effective way. But what will happen, we both don't know, Petra. Maybe the left will be a notion for our generation only.
Grazie.
Let's hope not. Guido.
Yes, good morning, and thanks a lot, Professor Morlino, and for the very important talk, and also thanks to the Scuola Normale for organizing these seminars. I have a question regarding this connection, the mutual connection between freedom and equality. I think that was really a crucial point that you made in your book and also in this presentation. And also my question is the following. Do you think that if inequalities increase, will also freedoms go down? I mean, you perhaps described a different story about Poland, but also beyond these European cases, do you think that there might be a connection? And I mean, if there is, I mean, what kind of connection between inequalities and democratic decline and autocratization? I mean, inequalities among the causes of autocratization, and for instance, I mean, how polarization might divide the political community among pro or anti-democratic groups, or inequalities among the consequences of autocratization, and therefore, I mean, for more, let's say, restrictive management of political power or some other legitimation issues. So, of course, I mean, I know this is a huge topic, perhaps different from this lecture, but I would love to hear your stances about this connection between inequality and autocratization. Thank you.
Inequality and
autocratization,
okay,
or
yes.
democratic decline.
Yes. Okay. No. Now, as I said, my previous research, this research show that stronger equality means a stronger freedom and vice versa. The condition for working of equality, for implementing equality, for implementing a better equality, is that you have to fully enjoy civil rights. So at this point, you can see very easily. Also the indirect connection with the accountability, because with the accountability, you need media, and to have working, effective, critical media, you have to have a freedom of media, and so on. So this is very clear. The opposite also should be very clear, because particularly today, let me add a crucial intervening factor today, that is the possibility to the social network, to the digital tools, to manipulate the public opinion. You have the possibility, if you are in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of social protection, if you have not this kind of elements, your real freedom is not in your hands. It's totally changed. It's much smaller, reduced and limited and constraints. So really, the two aspects there are, and we could say mostly there is an indirect connection, yes, but there is a connection, and the connection is strong, again, on both sides. To tell the truth, let me say something that, in a sense, is a little bit more, I have doubt, even when I tell you, if I say in the 80s, I could be open to say freedom may come first. Today, to me, particularly after the Great Recession, after the pandemic, equality comes first. At the end, in a sense, this is my conclusion. Unfortunate conclusion, but this is my conclusion.
Thank you, Leonardo. I have Guglielmo and then Giorgio. Guglielmo, please.
Thank you. It was very interesting. I also, because I've conducted a study in the same countries and in the same period on something much more narrow, that is employment rights and labor relations. And I found something similar in a different way. That is, in 30 years, in the 6 countries, collective rights have declined, but individual labor rights mostly have increased, or they haven't declined. The minimum wage, rights against non-discrimination, or new forms of labor rights, which means there is some attention to poverty, but there is less attention to democracy and economic democracy. However, I have one question on Poland, because many have said it is a limit case, it is a critical case. And in Poland, I don't think you can put democracy in one dimension only, because with regard to economic democracy, their attack is not very clear. I would say that actually, in terms of economic democracy, the PiS government has improved it, and currently has plans to improve it. It has improved the rights of organization, and it has plans to improve collective bargaining. So maybe it is going towards something that can be called, I don't know, neo-Peronism, something that is not entirely authoritarian, because within the economic sphere, it is actually improving the democratic, which makes it even more complicated than just the trade-off between equality and democracy, because it is also what kind of equality. It is mostly, as you said very clearly, against poverty rather than equality overall, but it is also what kind of democracy that is fewer civil rights, certainly, very clearly, less rule of law, but some more economic democracy. And that makes it even more complicated.
Guillermo, thank you very much. I agree with your presentation. Of course, the notion of economic democracy is a different notion vis-a-vis the notion of democracy I had in mind. This is, of course, obvious for you. But Guillermo, I address to you, in a sense, another question. What do you expect in the near future? This is a key point. That is, if you have a weakening of civil rights, a weakening of not social rights, a weakening of dignity of person, then what about the economic democracy? Is the economic democracy becoming so relevant, strengthening? I'm not sure. Again, the quality, the equality to be implemented even in the workplace need a full enjoying of civil rights. So again, fully agree, but what about in the near future?
I mean, very shortly, I agree there is a correlation between civil rights and social rights, but it's, in a way, as you also said in your more broader presentation, is not a direct and perfect correlation. And that would explain why PiS has a very strong positive relation with the trade unions, especially with one trade unions, but even the left-wing trade union is not generally against most of what the government does. So the correlation is not very precise, but I would agree that in the long term, to improve social rights without democracy will very probably lead to exclusionary social rights. That will depend on some political decision, and therefore they are easy to manipulate and make over some people and not other people. So it may lead to all sorts of problems. But it's in the short, medium period, because this correlation is not perfect, it is possible, I think, for a populist government to improve some social rights and even some economic democracy rights, which is something else. That is the voice, the right to organize, the right of voice in the enterprise, and some referenda about economic issues and so on, without improving the political, while at the same time, reducing the scope for political democracy. I don't think the correlation is a precise mechanical one, and there may be a bit of different pace, at the two levels.
Yeah, I agree. We can recall in connection with the relationship with unions how was central in the last electoral campaign of peace the minimum wage and the increasing of the minimum wage. So, okay.
Thank you. And I have a last intervention by Giorgio. But I don't see him any longer. Okay. So sometimes with online meeting, you have people disappearing, not because they want to, but because of the external
the connection, yes.
Yes. So, Leonardo, thank you very much. I think something that I still would like to discuss with you is the perspective of how path dependent versus how is the possibility of producing critical junctures, because it seems to me that in your presentation you stressed especially the path dependency element. And for instance, we had last year with us Goran Theborn, who analyzed instead Sweden as a case of extreme move towards inequalities, so changes. So there as well, when you also said that in assessing policies, for instance, policies towards the pandemics by the center-left government in Spain, we still need time. To see to which extent there is still a space. So I think this is an open question that would be...
No, you are fully right. You are fully right. We will see. We will see. You know, Donatella, the notion of a critical juncture is ex post facto notion. This is truth.
Yes, I know. And we still need to know how long do we have to wait in order to be able then to define it as a critical juncture. Yes. But at least we can, in a few months, invite you back and
very
see
willingly.
Which are the
very willingly.
Of this.
Very willingly.
Thank you very much to you, and thank you to all who have participated, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you all also for the questions, for the excellent discussion. Thank you, Donatella. Ciao, Valentina.
Thank you.